We did it independently, I want to stress again, and we reached our own conclusions. It was a complete and thorough examination of all the evidence independent of the district attorney's investigation. Make no mistake, there are a lot of hurt. There is a lot of hurt in this community today, and certainly in the home of the Clark family. Our investigation can't change what has happened, but we can make every effort to deliver a fair, thorough, and impartial review, which we promised this community when we took on this investigation. We were asked to evaluate whether there is a basis for the officers involved in this shooting to believe they were in imminent danger that would justify their use of force. From our review of all of the evidence, including digital and video evidence related to the shooting, a few critical facts emerged. First, the evidence establishes that Mr. Clark committed several unlawful acts by breaking the sliding glass door of a neighboring home, as well as breaking into cars, and that this fact was broadcast by police helicopter. Second, when confronted shortly after breaking the door, Mr. Clark did not follow officers' commands. Third, at the time of the shooting, the evidence establishes that Mr. Clark had advanced significantly towards the officers. He was not retreating. Fourth, on the video footage, we saw a bright light near Mr. Clark's person. It was clear he had something in his hand. And finally, the officers began firing upon seeing Mr. Clark advancing and stopped firing almost immediately after Mr. Clark fell to the ground. Our investigation also evaluated some facts that are relevant but did not, on their own, determine whether criminal charges were warranted. Both officers independently stated that they saw Mr. Clark assume a shooting position. After the shooting, video footage shows officers asking each other if they had been shot. After the shooting, officers waited for backup before approaching Mr. Clark, believing they were in danger. After the shooting, officers engaged in reloading their weapons one at a time after the shooting, with one providing cover for the other, believing they were in danger. We lay out the applicable legal standard in our report for this case. The part of the standard we need to focus on right now is the following. For a homicide to be justified, the person who has committed the homicide must have reasonably believed that she or someone else was in imminent danger of being killed or suffering great bodily injury, according to the law that we must apply in this case. Here is what we found to be the most critical evidence. First, the officers encountered a rapidly developing situation in which they were pursuing a suspect, Stephon Clark, who had broken the rear sliding glass door of the neighboring residence and who refused an officer's multiple commands to stop and show his hands. Second, Clark had an object in his hands, which we now know to have been a cell phone. And during the encounter, the officers repeated spontaneous shouts of "gun." And third, at the time of the shooting, Mr. Clark had moved from behind the picnic table in the backyard, where he was first seen, and advanced to a point within 16 feet from the officers. 16 feet. That's about between where I am and those of you in the third row are sitting. But before you get to the cameras, that's 16 feet. The distance where Mr. Clark was from the officers, having been a further distance away originally, 16 feet when the officers began shooting. And that was established by the STAR video, the video from the sheriff's helicopter, by the body cam footage, and by crime scene measurements. Based on our review of the facts and evidence in relation to the law, I'm here to announce today that our investigation has concluded that no criminal charges against the officers involved in the shooting can be sustained. I want to be clear, our investigation was confined solely to an examination of whether the facts of this case were sufficient to establish beyond a reasonable doubt whether a crime was committed by the officers. Our investigation and our report do not evaluate or address any issues relating to potential civil liability or law enforcement policies and procedures. Again, nothing can bring back Stephon Clark, and nothing helps end the pain that his family carries. The Department of Justice's investigation into this matter as a criminal case is now closed. It took us 11 months to write the story on the last minutes of the life of Stephon Clark. I know that this is not how Capt. Clark and Stephon Clark's loved ones wanted his story to end. I know this is not how our community wants any of these stories to end. So I want to close by extending my hand to Capt. Clark, to the Clark Thompson family, and to those who have adopted Stephon Clark or taken to heart the need to write different endings to these stories. This investigative report reflects the story my team and I wrote based on the facts and evidence before us. We did it by the book, and it will be open and transparent for you to read. But let's start writing these chapters. Let's start writing these chapters before shots are fired. Before we're writing a story from a place of grief, anger, and anticipation. And let's remember that some of the best writers and some of the best books rise from these tragedies and these places. Let's do this together. Our criminal investigation may be over, but our commitment to this community, to repairing trust between our peace officers and the people they are sworn to protect, goes on. Accountability must be a cornerstone of all the work we do, and every stakeholder is obliged to participate. Our police, our civic and community leaders, and the people of our communities whose safety is paramount. Everyone, not just law enforcement officers, have a stake in making sure that these tragic incidents are less frequent. We must all work together to achieve true, lasting public safety for our neighbors and our peace officers. With that, I'll take any questions.
In the report, that's a large report, and then you summarized nicely, but what else is in there that you haven't addressed?
I'm not sure. So here you see the work that was done by the Sacramento Police Department, its investigators, by the Department of Justice's investigators, and by the District Attorney's investigators. This is a compilation of the information we received. This here represents mostly some of the work that we did here based on much of what we got. What you don't see here are the mountains of data and information that represents the video footage, the audio sequencing, and other data that would be too voluminous to try to place here. But you can see it was a lot of work. What's missing? Gosh, I think we did everything we could to turn over every stone to figure out what we could about those minutes before Stephon Clark died.
Anything about the minutes leading up to and the text messages that the Sacramento County District Attorney?
That's all in the report, and that's all relevant. Anytime a an incident occurs where someone dies, where you believe there might be criminal activity and there might be criminal conduct involved, you certainly will do everything to look not just at the incident moving forward, but you look at what led up to the incident to see if that can guide you and give you relevant evidence. And so that is in these reports as well. But I think I pointed out the critical evidence and facts that we believe were pertinent to helping us decide whether or not there was a basis to charge the officers.
Sir, as you know,
I'll get to everybody.
Sir,
Let's just.
As you know, the officers never identified themselves as being with Sacramento Police. An attorney might make the argument that Stephon Clark didn't know that these were cops.
And the question is?
I mean, did that factor in your investigation?
We took all those factors into account. We looked at all the evidence that was before us. And as I said, the critical evidence that we relied upon to reach our conclusion, at the end of the day, I tried to summarize. But certainly we took into consideration all those different matters that were raised, including that one.
Is this something that would have led to a different conclusion had the law about use of force been different?
That'd be hard for me to respond to because we've been focused on this investigation. I urge you to review the report and all the evidence, and then you can reach a conclusion on your own. Yes.
You talked about the next chapters. You talked about the next chapters. Do you support changes to how these investigations are handled and or legislation that is going through the legislature right now?
We're right now, as we speak, working towards changes. And I have to tip my hat and thank Chief Hahn for giving me the opportunity not just to bring my team in to do a criminal investigation, but as you know, he was willing to let me through the doors of the Sacramento Police Department to review their policies and practices and provide him and his team of officers with our report on what could be the best practices and where they could focus. And so we produced the first part of that report for him. Some of those items that we point out, he's already adopted even before the report was issued, and we're going to continue, and we will release that second half of the report. We hope that not just SAC PD, but law enforcement agencies throughout our state and hopefully beyond will take a look at the product of this work because we hope it will reveal what some of the best practices would be and to help us get to the point, as I said, where we're writing much better chapters about our public safety.
What was the determining factor that you found that these police officers were an imminent threat?
It's not one particular factor. It's as I said, when you see the compilation of the evidence. And I think it's very important. There's a lot of evidence, but there's some evidence that really can't be disputed. And that objective evidence formed the principal basis for us reaching these conclusions about what was confronting the officers, the circumstances they found themselves in. Remember, they were there not on their own. They were there responding to a 911 call. And then they got a call on someone who was committing some acts that were unlawful. However you categorize them, they were there to make sure to keep the peace. And as the scene developed, they started to get further reports, including that the subject had broken the glass of a sliding glass door, and we have no idea what the purpose of that was, but there was an 80 to 90-year-old individual in that home, I believe, by himself. And so the officers are acting on all this information. They spot a subject. They issue commands to raise his hands, to stop. The subject does not heed the commands, and so you can see it develops, and it's all very rapid. And while it took place over a course of 10, 20 minutes, the actual incident where the shooting occurred was a matter of seconds.
Okay, so,
yes.
So let's say two cops are running at you in the dark. You can't see them very well. They have guns drawn and they are ordering you to comply. You're saying legally they don't have to identify themselves as cops, and legally you have to comply? So,
okay, we can't recreate everything in the incident, but we do know that there was a helicopter overhead that was illuminating the area where the subject, who we now know was Mr. Clark, was in the vicinity and in these yards, where the officers in the helicopter could see Mr. Clark break the sliding glass door. They report that to the, if I could finish, they report that to the officers. They are searching for a suspect. Whether and how, what happened in terms of what Mr. Clark saw, we can never know. But the officers spot Mr. Clark, shouts out commands, and
They didn't identify themselves.
and Mr. Clark then runs. And the facts that we see before us are the officers trying to pursue a subject that's been identified as having been engaged in some activities which are unlawful, and so they pursue him. There are any number of pieces of this story that we'll never totally get, but from the objective facts, we can see what happened in the backyard. The video from the video cam shows that Mr. Clark is facing the officers. He no longer flees.
Objectively, they never identified themselves as officers.
As I said, the objective facts are before us, and based on those objective facts, we make a determination of what the officers were perceiving and how they could act. So let me.
The recitation of the critical evidence seems pretty overwhelming in favor of the officers. How close a call was this decision in this investigation? Was it as open and shut as it sounds here? Was this a close call?
Yeah.
Which way this could go?
So, as I said, there's lots of evidence. There are any number of facts. I chose to focus on the facts that we relied on most. That doesn't mean that there was an absence of facts otherwise, but I chose so you would understand the thinking that went behind. And this is I do this as much for you as quite honestly I do it for the Clark family, so they can understand out of everything that happened, out of everything that can be raised, how we arrived at our decision on whether or not we could charge these officers.
Was it a tough call then?
Yeah, there's a young man who's no longer alive with two sons who won't have a father, whose mother I just met with, who's grieving. Of course it was a tough call. These are all tough calls. It's never easy. But we have to do the job.